It is my great pleasure today to talk to you about a great movie that most of you have probably never heard of, but that's a good thing because it's one of the best movies you've probably never heard of. That movie is called Late August at the Hotel Ozone. It's a movie from Czechoslovakia from, I think, 1968. It's an amazing, fantastic, incredibly powerful movie. And towards the end of the video, we'll also be talking a little bit about our preconceptions about movies from Eastern Europe, which is the big topic of this channel. And that preconception is that these are movies from the communist era and that they are filled with propaganda or that they're subversive. And so the filmmakers are either creating big propaganda movies for communism, or the idea we have is that filmmakers are against communism and they're being brave rebels and so forth. And that is almost completely false. That is a preconception we have. So we'll be talking about that later on. But first of all, what is the movie? Well, it's kind of like an Ingmar Bergman version of a post-apocalyptic movie. Or like, what if Tarkovsky had directed a Fallout movie? It's an art house film, but a very accessible art house film because it's so well made and so powerful. And what is the story of Late August at the Hotel Ozone? Well, there was a World War III, and nuclear devastation and very few survivors. And what we'll be doing throughout the movie is following a band of 5 or 6 young girls. They're between 15 and 20 approximately, and they're led by an old lady who at first seems very strict. She's leading that band of young girls throughout the wasteland, and they seem to be walking aimlessly, but actually what their aim is to find other human beings with which to reconstruct the human race. So we find out throughout that as they're, scrounging for bullets and for rusted cans to find something to eat, the old lady is leading this band of young girls in the hope of finding at least one male, who can impregnate them, basically, and create a new human race. And eventually, not to spoil anything, but eventually they do find at least one male later on in the movie, quite late in the movie, and things take a couple of very interesting turns at that point. So what does happen, I won't spoil it, I will encourage you to watch it, but it feels both inevitable and completely shocking what happens in the movie. It's quite a blow to the stomach. It took me like a couple of days, almost like a week to get over the movie. I saw it maybe like a month ago or something like that. It's one of those movies that really lingers with you and stays with you and kind of refuses to let go. It's incredibly powerful. At the same time, it's very accessible. It's very watchable. So what makes it so powerful? Well, what makes it so powerful is that the movie pulls the rug out of under us. It has a kind of bait and switch trick that it pulls on us, which is basically that we have these young girls. They're very nice, they're very beautiful, and obviously they're kind of almost like kids being kids. While we do see that the kids, the young girls are not always wise or not always, very smart, we do feel like empathy as human beings. There's one scene in particular in the beginning where, they're looking for bullets, and one of the girls finds a bunch of rusted bullets. Just for laughs, one of the girls throws the bullets in a fire with which they've started. Oh, this will be funny. Let's just throw bullets in the fire. And obviously what happens is that the bullets start flying all over the place, basically as if they had pressed a button in the to fire random bullets all over the place. So they shelter themselves as best as they can, and I think nobody really gets hurt. But once the old lady, once the bullets stop flying and the old lady, finds out who did it, she slaps the girl pretty vigorously. It was obviously a stupid thing to do, but she, at the same time, slapping a girl may be justified in this context, but it's still pretty harsh, right? It's not cool. But as the movie progresses and we learn more and more about what's going on, it's pretty clear that, she's the old lady is that way because she's the only one who kind of remembers what the old world was like, and what she's basically leading is what we'll discover is a bunch of savages. That's kind of where the bait and switch happens, because we don't realize until the very end and I am kind of spoiling the direction the movie takes. Certainly I won't spoil everything, but we really underestimate as we watch the movie just how far civilization has fallen, just how much of the common humanity we take for granted in this post-apocalyptic world has been lost. And ultimately, kind of spoilers in 3, 2, 1. At the end of the movie, they're monsters. That's the thing. The bait and switch is that we see the young girls as vulnerable and innocent, but they're not far from mindless brutes. And once you've seen the movie, it's one of those movies where you think back and you see, oh yeah, it was there all along. I just didn't see it. During one scene, after like maybe 45 minutes or something, they come across an animal and they shoot it right away. The first thing they do is shoot the animal, kill the animal, skin the animal. They're very joyful in that, like eviscerating the animal, because they're going to have meat, right? They basically never have meat. All they have is rusted cans for food, right? So it's not that great. So there are instances like that where you look back at the movie and you say, yeah, I see them as fellow human beings, but what I think what the movie posits is that a huge part of that shared humanity comes from our habits as, let's say, civilized people. The distinction here is not between, like civilized and, let's say, Native Americans or like a tribe in the Amazon. It's not that. It's not civilized in opposition to what used to be called primitive cultures or tribes. It's not that. It's more along the lines that they have gone beyond social organization. They are basically just animals. It's kind of like that. And what the movie shows us is just how much has been lost, because they can still appreciate music, for instance, but they've never heard it before. So eventually there's a scene in the movie where they hear music for the first time and they're completely astonished, like it's absolutely marvelous. There are videos on YouTube of elephants listening to music and being completely enthralled. So it's kind of like that. They're really like hyper emotional, and it's so beautiful, right, this music. It's showing us that they still have the potential to be sublime beings, as human beings are wont to be. But with the collapse of civilization has come a collapse of, in this universe of the movie, our ability to be human. And, ultimately, I have a more optimistic view of human beings than the movie presents, but it's a very powerful exposition of a type of behavior that you do recognize. It has been seen before. That civilization collapsed into barbarism, right? So, and that's kind of what the movie shows, but it shows it in a very subtle way. And that's the whole point, basically. It's very subtle. It's also very beautiful. It's my second point. So the core feeling of the movie is a sense of utter desolation, and it's brilliantly done with essentially no budget and no technical means. It's all done through craft and creativity and framing and narrative, okay? Because all we're seeing is girls walking with this lady, this group of women walking in the forest or walking in the ruins and shooting at things and eating cans and so forth. But that's basically what we're seeing. But it's like a visual poem about this complete sense of desolation. So there's one scene in particular that is very powerful and revealing of the whole. That's the moment where you kind of realize, okay, this is what's going on. Because for the first 20-25 minutes, we know there's been nuclear, devastation and so forth. But the movie lets you figure out the plot by yourself. And that scene I'm about to explain very quickly is that moment where you really figure out, okay, this is what's going on. So basically, They come across this church, which is almost falling apart. And in this church, as they're looking for bullets and cans and so forth, the old lady notices there are chalk signs on the walls. She's walking around, and she's been walking around for like 10-15 minutes, and she sees this chalk sign on the wall. And she checks the chalk, and it's fresh. This is a new chalk sign. And after 2 or 3 chalk signs like that, you figure out that, okay, so there's another person here. And the old lady is super excited. So she's hyper excited because there's someone here. So this means that that's what she's looking for, yes? So she starts looking around the church, and eventually what she finds out is that it's one of the girls. And she's kind of got lost, and she found herself in a very dangerous position, like on the upper floor, but the floor is about to collapse. It's very dangerous, and the old lady saves her. And the young girl still has the chalk in her hand, right? So the old lady sees the chalk, and she realizes that it was this young girl all along. So there's nobody here. There's kind of a similar scene in Damnation Alley, the post-apocalyptic movies from the 70s. We know the strange truck, and the movie, it's not very good. I don't think it's very good, but the truck is very cool. And there's one scene where our band of post-apocalyptic heroes, they've heard a sign on the radio, right? And so they think that, okay, there's some survivors in like New York City, and they're crossing the desolated United States to find these survivors. And eventually they find out that again, I'm kind of spoiling it, but it's the wind activating a telegram prompter. Again, the movie is not good, but that scene is incredibly powerful. If you've lived in the Cold War era with the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, people make fun of it today as if we're like, I lived it, right? The end of it. And the way it's talked about today is like, people were so stupid in the 70s and the 80s because they were afraid of nuclear annihilation, which was a constant threat, which we came this close to total nuclear annihilation many times during the Cold War. So it's not stupid to be afraid of total annihilation, you see. And these movies, Damnation Alley and Late August at the Hotel Ozone, they express that fear, and they express the utter devastation of what we stand to lose if we lose everything. Like, what is the actual feeling of losing everything, which is kind of comparable to the feeling in the environmental message. Some people minimize that feeling, but what is the actual feeling of we've destroyed the ecology of the planet and countless species and so forth. So there's an emotion there. It's a very powerful and a very uncomfortable emotion, this sense of like, we really are close to losing everything. And these movies express that. Even in the worst post-apocalyptic movies, you can feel that, and that makes the movies powerful, such as Damnation Alley. But when you have a movie like Late August at the Hotel Ozone, which is so filled with artistic talent and vision, and it's made with real artists, with real artistic talent, and it works, because sometimes, Damnation Alley, I'm sure there were talented people involved, like plenty of them, but it doesn't work as a piece of art. So when you have a movie that works both as not a popcorn movie because the emotions are very heavy, but it works just as a simple narrative, right? It works as an experience of watching the movie. You're never bored watching the movie. It works on that level. It works on just the experience of sitting through a movie and kind of enjoying it. It works on that level. But it also works as a beautiful object, as a thing of beauty. So when you have that, you have something that is beautifully built and that manages to express that feeling of utter, it's beyond dread, the sense of desolation that is so linked with the experience of modernity, right? 20th century, 21st century, like the constant, we're all living with the constant threat of the loss of everything. Yes, we spend a lot of time denying that, but these movies allow us to process that, and maybe because it allows us to stay with that feeling because we're no longer denying those feelings, we can let whatever solutions might be applicable for this moment here and now for me. It lets these actions or solutions or ways of seeing things come out from our intuition is basically what I'm saying here. It's allowing us to uncover the feelings we have buried, and that's basically always good. That's the only way to find solutions to anything, is to stop burying what we're feeling. That's the short version. So last things I'm going to say for now about the qualities of the movie itself is that it is extremely beautiful and artful. So I've actually mentioned it quite a few times, but what do I mean by here? I will give only one example. We have a post-apocalyptic movie which seems to have a very, 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 very small budget. And we see this because there's no action. There's one gun, but there are no very few sets. It's just actors walking in a field is basically what we're seeing. Kind of like in Stalker, yes? So how does the movie show us the end of the world? Probably the most beautiful way I've ever seen, the most skillful way. It's incredibly brilliant. The movie begins with a falling tree, just a shot of a falling tree. And then we see the stump of the tree. And as you know, as trees grow, when you cut a tree, you see the concentric circles, and there's a circle for every year that, the tree has been on Earth. And as it happens, the movie shows us this tree falling. An old lady's hand and an old lady's voice is pointing to those circles, and the voice is saying, okay, this is where I was born. And this is where, in this circle here, I went to school. And in this circle here, I had my first job. And this circle here is when the bombs fell. And she's explaining, actually, she's telling us the story of the apocalypse, the nuclear apocalypse, by pointing the circles on this tree, yes? Okay, this is where we found this girl, and this is where this girl drowned. What it's kind of similar to is the beginning of Mad Max 2, okay? Because if you rewatch it, there's a prologue which explains the apocalypse in Mad Max 2. And George Miller is really, I think, underrated as a filmmaker. He's a really, really powerful, once again, artist and filmmaker. So there's something comparable in the way that, George Miller pulls together, archive footage of, riots and so forth. And he kind of builds this story, and there's a comparable feel. Someone from many years after the apocalypse, telling of the apocalypse, but like 50, 60 years afterwards. So it kind of feels similar. The sensibility is comparable, but I would say the level of skill is kind of comparable. But the solution that the filmmaker here, what's his name? So the solution that Jan Schmidt is his name, the director, finds to explain this apocalypse is through this old lady explaining the history of the apocalypse through the rings of the tree. It's simple. It's very simple. It's very elegant, and it's very powerful. And it's one of those situations where we often hear this idea that having no budget forces you to be creative, and sometimes people extol the virtues of having no budget for your movie. But obviously, if you can have a big budget, it's better. It's very rare, in fact, that you will see movies that actually rise up to the challenge of having no budget and having to create, in this case, for instance, a post-apocalyptic masterpiece. And Jan Schmidt does it with this movie. Like Late August, the Hotel Ozone does that. It's beautiful. It's in black and white. It's one of those movies where the black and white photo really enhances the experience. I was thinking for some reason of Seconds, the John Frankenheimer movie, the suspense movie, which is very, very good. If you've never seen it, it's like one of the best suspense science fiction movies of the 60s by far. Incredibly powerful film with Rock Hudson. Frankenheimer, a very visual director, and one of the most memorable aspects of Seconds is this very skillful use of black and white photography. So that's kind of like the level of artistry that you have in late August at the Hotel Ozone. So basically that's what you have. You have a very beautifully shot and beautifully constructed and beautifully told story about the end of the world and ultimately the end of humanity, because there's very little chance that you know, again, you might come to a different conclusion, but once the movie is finished, there's no way after that, the end of that movie, that humanity can survive. I mean, but again, it's so subtle the way it's done, and it's so skillful, and it's so, you know, beautifully done. So it's like a, you know, a black and white poem about the end of the world and about the depths humanity can sink to if we let go, if we forget our own humanity. So basically that's the movie, and it comes with my highest recommendation. Very, very powerful film. And quickly, I mentioned the thing about, you know, about propaganda and subversion in Eastern European movies. And this is a discussion I've been having with Alexander from Russia, and also with he has a blog in Russia, so there's a kind of this informal discussion going on in the comments about just how much, you know, propaganda and ideology and so forth there was to be found in Eastern European movies. And I talk about this because I actually think that the question of propaganda in this movie is just an illustration of a deeper problem, and it's the reason I'm mentioning it now. A deeper problem on a human level, like us as human beings on Earth right now. You know, a condition of our humanity at this period of history is illustrated by this problem of the idea of propaganda in Eastern movies. So quickly, the idea is that because I come from North America, I'm from Quebec, so we're in Canada, we were conquered by the British, and we live next to the United States, who ruled the world. You know, Americans are very nice as human beings, they're very great people. I've never met, I think, an unpleasant American person, but they still rule the world, right? They still have the most powerful country on earth, and they know it, yes. For 60, 70 years, since the end of the Second World War, the dominant discourse has come, at least in the West, from the United States. So there are 1,500 science fiction movies from the United States that were made during the Cold War, and just to compare, about 100 were made in the USSR. You know, so it's a 15-to-1 ratio. From Czechoslovakia, I think around 40. In Czechoslovakia, just a side note here, if you've never heard of Czechoslovak movies, which was my case, like a year and a half ago, I knew basically nothing about Czech movies. They're awesome. They're amazing. They're the best kept secret in world cinema. The most undervalued, underestimated like national cinema on earth, to my knowledge, comes from Czechoslovakia. They're amazing movies. That said, just about every country makes great movies, but the Czech movies, there's a lot of them. They're beautiful, they're smart, they're amazing, and certainly the science fiction movies, so well worth digging into. There's maybe like 40, 50, I think, science fiction movies that were made in Czechoslovakia during the Cold War, so 40, 50 movies is a lot less than 1,500 from the United States. And the movie industry in the United States is not a propaganda machine per se. It's not a state-driven propaganda machine, but it still plays that function. Okay. And this is just a short version here. I won't go into too much details, but if you think about it, you know, like during the Second World War, the movie industry started to make, you know, propaganda movies against the Germans. Yes, so they weren't told by the state, by the president, they weren't ordered to start making propaganda movies against the Nazis. Yes, they just started doing it, and it would be interesting to see just what the motivations were. How much of those propaganda movies made by the U.S. during the Second World War, how much of that came from, you know, a sincere feeling from the filmmakers and the movie producers that, we needed to beat fascism and so forth. And how much of it was opportunity, like just being opportunistic. There are probably a ton of different motivations for that, for the reason there were so many, propaganda movies in Hollywood during the Second World War. What we tend to forget is that, when essentially the Soviets, the Americans, and the British won the war, the Axis was defeated, but immediately after the end of the Second World War, that's when the Cold War started. So there was never a period of peace, of actual peace. The Cold War started immediately. It's a continuation of the politics of the early 20th century and the 19th centuries. There's a lot going on there, so there's a lot going on in the relationship between the British Empire and later the American Empire, and there's a lot of realpolitik going on there. So to go back to the idea of the propaganda movie, our idea that the Soviet movies or the Czechoslovak movies are filled with propaganda, we went immediately from a period in the Second World War where the movie industry was, of its own volition, putting out an endless stream of propaganda movies, okay, in this war against the enemy, which was the Germans and the Japanese. But because we went directly from the Second World War to the Cold War, because there was no transition, it just went straight from one to the other. The Cold War basically starts during the end of the Second World War, so there's already some tensions. So because of that, the propaganda machine in Hollywood, it wasn't dismantled. It was not necessary for Hollywood to be told by the state that they needed to put out propaganda against the Soviets, because they were already used to making movies that were propaganda. And it does not matter if you think the propaganda is right, like the Nazis were bad. Well, yes, obviously the Nazis were bad, but that does not change the fact that a movie like, Invisible Agent, for instance, Universal movie and part of the Invisible Man series, well, if you watch it, the son of the Invisible Man against Nazis, well, yes, so the Nazis were bad, but the Nazis in the movie are like a stupid caricature of the historical Nazis. It's fascinating to see and important to point out that when a propaganda movie demonizes the enemy, even if you have an enemy that is essentially demonic for real, like the Nazis, or I'm not saying they were possessed by actual demons, but I'm just saying they were bad, they were evil. Yeah, the Nazi regime is completely bad. But why is it that in the propaganda movies, Hollywood still felt it was necessary to put out a caricature of the Nazis? Why didn't they just show the way Nazis actually behaved, which was horrible? So that's an interesting question, which we'll probably come back to eventually. But for now, what we need to remember is that the West has been living for about 80 years in an environment where we're constantly bathing and inundated by propaganda by the dominant power. We don't want to hear it because we've been conditioned to think that propaganda is what the other side does. And for this topic here, it actually does not matter that much whether or how much the other side does propaganda. Even if there were propaganda in late August in the Hotel Ozone, which there isn't, I'll come back to that in an instant. What I've discovered in the last few months as a movie watcher, a movie enthusiast, what I've discovered by paying attention to what I was actually seeing and processing what I was seeing, is that all the propaganda I was seeing in those movies is stuff I was projecting onto it. I see propaganda in those movies because I expect propaganda to be there. And I expect propaganda to be there because I'm part of this culture, like in the West. And if you look on, IMDb reviews or movie forums or YouTube comments or on Letterboxd, anywhere people talk about movies, if they talk about Soviet movies or movies from Eastern Europe, do the test today if you like. Check the comments about any movie from the Soviet Union. See how long it takes before someone either says that it's filled with propaganda or it's a subversion of the USSR. Almost immediately. It's like always one of the first comments that people bring up. Okay? Because we're conditioned culturally to think of movies from Eastern Europe, which most of the time we've never seen, to think of those movies as propaganda. In the case of Late August at the Hotel Ozone, it is very, 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 very hard to put forth a good faith argument that there is any propaganda at all in this movie. There just isn't any. I don't think any countries are mentioned. And the whole message of the movie is that, nuclear annihilation is bad. That's the message of the film. That's what the movie says. So the only way to say that this movie is propaganda is to say that, those dastardly evil communists want to sap our willpower, our resolve, by trying to convince us that the total annihilation of everything through nuclear Armageddon would be a bad thing, And I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be that surprised if some people had put forth such an argument, but I put it to you that it's not a good faith argument. That is an ideologically driven argument. Okay. So one of the questions that is well worth our time, again, as human beings on Earth right now, is how much of my reactions, of my ways of seeing the world, how much of that comes from cultural, ideological conditioning. Ideology just makes Pavlov dogs out of us. You ring the bell, and the bell here is, it's a movie from Eastern Europe. So you ring the bell, the reflex, like Pavlov's dog, starts salivating because he thinks he's going to get food, right? So for us, we see, we hear communism and we say, it's propaganda, but it's a reflex. It's actually like a neurological reflex. It's a physiological response. We think we're thinking, but all we're doing is having a physiological response. So basically, that's it. And the movie works because, as I said, it plays on our expectations, yes, because we expect the movie to be about this hard old woman and these beautiful young girls or brave and, and the rebuilding of humanity. But the movie plays on all those expectations and flips them on their head. It's not so much that the movie tricks us, but that we trick ourselves because we're seeing the movie not for what it's telling us, but for what we think it's going to be saying. We think it's going to be about a harsh old woman and these brave young girls, but actually it's not that. It's the young girls are monsters once again. What makes the movie work is that the movie is conscious that it's playing on our expectations. But that mechanism that makes the movie work is basically the same mechanism on which ideology is built, on which propaganda is built. It trains you to think a certain way, to have mental habits, through repetition. And it does so to such an extent that eventually all you're seeing when you're seeing a movie like this, for instance, is what you expect to see, which is propaganda. So if we want to see what's actually there, what's actually going on, if we want to be useful in whatever, causes or, are important to us, if we want to be helpful in matters that, move our heart, we have to see clearly. And one of the first steps is identifying when we're having those reflexes of not seeing what's actually there, but just reacting through force of mental habit to what we think is going to be there, because we're just used to thinking it's there. So if we want to be helpful, we have to see what's actually there and take that in and react from there and act from there. So that's kind of a meta lesson we can get from the movie. But once again, the movie is really beautiful. It's very powerful. It's very strong and not very often talked about, but well worth your time. I strongly encourage you to see it. If you're like me, it'll probably stay with you for many, many days, if not weeks, and maybe even longer. It's a very powerful film. I do offer some consulting if you're If you're curious, like personal consulting, my specialty is like, existential crises, like big existential crises. If you're curious, just send me a message or write me in the comments. But for now, keep watching the skies. Life is beautiful. Take care. See you later.